The envelope was already open. I noticed that first. Not the papers inside. Not the amount written across the top. Just the flap. Bent back too neatly, like someone had opened it carefully and tried to make it look untouched. My father was standing by the kitchen window. My mother was drying the same plate for too long. No one looked at me when I walked in. The house was quiet in a way I hadn't heard before. Not peaceful. Controlled. My mother finally smiled and asked how work was going. Too casually. My father asked whether business had been steady lately, using the same tone people use when they already know the answer and are checking whether you'll lie. I set my keys down and looked at the envelope again. It had my company's bank logo on it. That's when I realized something was very wrong. I used to think people got used to being underestimated. That after enough years of hearing the same words, they stopped landing. Failure. Risky. Unstable. A phase. My parents had their own versions, repeated so often they turned into background noise. When I left a safe office job to build my own logistics software company, they told relatives I was between careers. When the business survived its first year, they called it luck. When it started making real money, they stopped asking what I did and started asking whether I was finally thinking long-term. I was 32 by then. I rented a clean apartment, paid my bills on time, employed 8 people, and had more work than I could accept. But in that house, I was still the child who had disappointed them by refusing the life they had already chosen for me. I visited every other Sunday. It kept things simple. That afternoon was supposed to be routine. Tea. Small talk. My mother asking whether I was eating properly. My father pretending not to care about anything personal while gathering information the way he always did, quietly, piece by piece. But something was different. The envelope should have been in my hand, not on their table. I knew that. My business mail still occasionally went there because I had used their address in the early months before I moved offices. I had updated almost everything, but once in a while, something slipped through. Usually they mentioned it. Usually they made a point of telling me they had saved something important for me. This time, no one mentioned it at all. I sat down and asked if any mail had come for me. My mother folded the dish towel and said, "Just advertisements." My father took a sip of tea and asked whether I was still overworking that little company. I said maybe. Then I asked again, more casually, whether anything from the bank had arrived. My mother gave the smallest pause. Less than a second. Then she said no. That was the first crack. I stayed another 20 minutes. I talked about traffic. About a client delay. About nothing. My father relaxed when he thought I'd let it go. My mother started asking about my younger brother, as if redirecting the conversation would reset the room. He was the successful one in their eyes. Stable salary. Nice title. Mortgage. Approved life. When I left, my father walked me to the door and clapped my shoulder. "You worry too much," he said. "That's always been your problem." I nodded like I agreed. On the drive home, I called the bank and asked for a digital copy of the statement that had been mailed. The representative sent it while I was still parked at a red light. I opened it. Then I looked at it again. There had been a request for a linked access form on one of my business reserve accounts. Not completed. Not approved. Just initiated. Using my old residential mailing address. There were no funds missing. No successful changes. Nothing final. But someone had taken the first step. Someone with enough information to know which account existed, where statements might still go, and how to begin. I called my mother that evening and asked one last time whether any bank mail had arrived. She laughed softly, like I was being difficult for no reason. "You're making something out of nothing," she said. "Honestly, you've always been suspicious. That's why people don't trust you." That sentence stayed with me longer than the rest. Not because it hurt. Because it was too prepared. The next morning I changed every credential connected to my business accounts. Then I said nothing to anyone. Not to my parents. Not to my brother. Not even to the friend who handled some of my tax filings. I kept working. I kept answering calls. I kept showing up for Sunday tea. And I started noticing things I should have seen earlier. Questions that were too specific. Comments that leaned too close to my finances. My father asking whether retained earnings could just sit unused. My mother wondering whether business owners ever helped family informally. My brother suddenly interested in what my company was worth, though he'd spent years mocking it as unstable. Nothing was direct. That was what made it worse. Because once people think your silence means weakness, they get careless. So I stopped reacting. And I started watching. The proof arrived 3 days later, and it didn't come from my parents. It came from a branch manager I had met once during a financing review 2 years earlier. I had moved most of my accounts online, but I still believed in knowing at least one real person at the bank. It was one of those habits people call paranoid right up until it saves them. She called just after noon. Her voice was careful. Professional. She said there had been an unusual follow-up inquiry connected to the incomplete access request on my reserve account. Nothing had been approved. No money had moved. But someone had called, referenced the mailed statement, and tried to clarify next steps. I asked whether the call had been recorded. She said yes. I asked whether she could release it directly. She said no, but she could note the incident formally and advise me to come in person if I believed it involved attempted fraud. So I went. I expected confusion. A misunderstanding. Something partial. Instead, I was led into a small office, handed a printed incident summary, and allowed to listen to the recording with the branch manager present. It was my father's voice. Not angry. Not nervous. Calm. Familiar. The voice he used with mechanics, receptionists, and service staff when he wanted to sound reasonable and entitled at the same time. He identified himself as my father. Said he had received financial documents for me at the family address. Said I was extremely busy and had asked him to help sort out administrative details. Then he asked what documents were needed to gain access if a business owner wanted to authorize a parent for emergency support. He never explicitly claimed to be me. He was too careful for that. But he was gathering a path. Then the second part came. The manager played another recording from the day before. This time my mother was on the line. Her tone was softer, more hesitant, but the script underneath was the same. She said I was under pressure. Said I had never been good with paperwork. Said the family was trying to help me manage things before I made another bad decision. I listened without interrupting. The manager paused the audio and slid the printed log toward me. It listed both call times. The questions asked. The mailing reference used. The old address. The account ending digits. Facts only. No interpretation was needed. What shook me wasn't the attempt itself. It was how long they must have been discussing it before they acted. My parents weren't impulsive people. They rehearsed things. They normalized them first. They turned them into practical choices. On my way out, the manager asked whether I wanted to file a formal internal fraud alert. I said yes. Then I asked whether anyone had come in physically. She checked. One person had. My brother. 2 days earlier. He hadn't asked for access directly. He had asked general questions about family-supported businesses and whether a company owner could assign someone to review emergency financial documents if they were unavailable. He left no paperwork. Signed nothing. But his visit was logged because he had referenced my surname, my parents' address, and my company name together. That was the moment the whole shape of it became clear. This wasn't concern. It wasn't a clumsy family discussion about loans. It was a quiet plan. I left the bank and sat in my car for almost an hour, not because I was emotional, but because I was reorganizing everything I thought I knew. For years they had mocked the business. Called it fragile. Temporary. Embarrassing. Yet behind my back, they had tracked it closely enough to know where to probe. That evening, my mother called and asked whether I could come by Friday. She said my father wanted to talk about something important. I told her I was busy. She said, "It's about family. Try not to make everything transactional." I almost laughed at that. Instead, I opened the incident summary again. I replayed the facts in order. 2 calls. One visit. Same objective. Same assumption, that I would either never notice or would be too conditioned to challenge them if I did. I didn't call anyone out. I didn't warn them. I exported the digital account logs, saved the bank emails, requested certified copies of the incident report, and wrote down every unusual question my family had asked me over the past 2 months while it was still fresh. By midnight, the pattern was no longer a suspicion. It was evidence. And once I had that, anger became unnecessary. Confronting them would have ruined everything. Once the pattern was clear, I stopped thinking about it like a family problem. I started treating it like a security problem. The first thing I did was separate everything that mattered. My primary operating accounts were already protected, but I moved the reserve funds to a different institution entirely. Quietly. No announcements. No transfers that would trigger attention if someone happened to glance at a statement. Then I created distance. Every account now required in-person authorization tied to biometric verification. No paper forms mailed to residential addresses. No phone authorizations. Nothing that could be initiated by someone pretending to help. It took 2 days. After that, I began securing the evidence. The bank provided certified copies of the call recordings and the internal incident log. I stored them in 3 places: encrypted cloud storage, an external drive in my office safe, and a sealed copy with my attorney. I hadn't spoken to that attorney in months, but he understood immediately when I asked for a short meeting. I didn't dramatize anything. I simply laid the documents on the table. The call transcripts. The access initiation request. The log showing my brother's visit. The attorney read everything slowly. When he finished, he asked a single question. Do you want protection, or do you want confrontation? I told him protection. He nodded. That answer changed the strategy. Within a week, several quiet steps were taken. My business address was updated across every financial registry. A formal note was attached to my accounts indicating that any third-party inquiries referencing family relationships should trigger an internal compliance review. We also documented the attempted access as a precautionary fraud incident. Not a lawsuit. Not a complaint against my parents. Just a legal record that the bank had already acknowledged. That way, if anything escalated later, there would already be a trail. Meanwhile, my parents behaved exactly the way people behave when they believe nothing has gone wrong. My mother called twice asking whether I could drop by soon. My father sent a short message asking whether I had considered more stable financial planning. My brother texted a link to an article about businesses failing in economic downturns. Each message felt rehearsed in its own way. They were testing the ground. They were waiting for the moment when I would either ask them for help, or when they could claim they were stepping in to provide it. I responded the same way every time. Short answers. Polite tone. No information. 2 weeks later, my mother called again and said my father wanted the family to have dinner together that Sunday. She used the same voice people use when they're announcing something already decided. Your father has something important to discuss, she said. I asked what it was. She said, it's about the future. I agreed to come. That night, I sent my attorney a short message confirming the time and location of the dinner. I also forwarded the bank recordings and the certified incident log to a compliance officer who handled fraud investigations at the institution. Not because I expected a scene. Because preparation makes scenes unnecessary. On Sunday, I arrived exactly on time. The house looked the same as it always had. Same furniture. Same photographs. Same quiet living room where I had spent years being told that my plans were unrealistic. My brother was already there, sitting comfortably at the table. My father poured wine. My mother placed plates like it was a normal evening. No one knew that 3 separate records already existed documenting their attempt to access my accounts. No one knew that the bank had flagged their names internally. And no one knew that if another request was made, it would trigger an automatic investigation. Dinner started slowly. My father talked about the economy. My brother mentioned housing prices. My mother asked about my little company again. Then my father leaned back in his chair and said something that finally explained everything. He said, "We've been thinking about what happens when your business collapses." He said it calmly, like a practical concern. Then he explained their solution. They wanted to be added to my financial accounts. Temporarily, of course. Just to help protect family assets in case I made another mistake. My brother nodded along as if it had already been agreed. I listened without interrupting. Then I said I would consider it. The room relaxed immediately. They thought the conversation had gone exactly the way they expected. But while they finished dinner, my phone sent a quiet message confirming something important. The compliance officer had scheduled a formal review. They thought it was just another day. It wasn't. The dinner ended without conflict. That was the first thing that surprised them. When people expect resistance and don't get it, they relax. My father poured another glass of wine. My mother cleared the plates. My brother leaned back in his chair and started talking about a promotion he hoped to get. No one asked for an answer about the accounts again that night. They assumed they had planted the idea. That I would think about it. That eventually I would agree. I left just before 10. In the driveway, my father said something he had said to me many times over the years. "You'll understand when you're older," he told me. "Family looks out for family." I nodded once and drove home. The next morning, the bank called. Not the branch manager this time. A compliance officer from the institution's internal fraud unit. Calm voice. Formal tone. She explained that because of the earlier access attempts and the recordings attached to them, the bank had initiated a precautionary review of third-party inquiries related to my accounts. She asked whether I had authorized any family members to request information. I said no. She documented it. That one word was enough. By noon, the bank had flagged the earlier calls and the in-person inquiry as potential unauthorized access attempts. The recordings and visit log were moved into a formal case file. Again, it wasn't a criminal accusation. Not yet. Just documentation. But documentation changes things. 2 days later, my father called the bank again. He didn't know about the case file. He didn't know the earlier calls had already been attached to an internal investigation. He simply repeated what he had said before, mentioning the mailed statements, explaining that he was helping his son manage things, asking what steps were needed for family oversight. This time, the representative didn't answer his questions. Instead, the call was transferred. The compliance officer informed him that the account holder had not authorized any third-party access and that further attempts to obtain information could be considered fraudulent representation. My father hung up. I didn't hear about it until later that afternoon, when the officer called to inform me the case had been escalated. My brother made the next mistake. 3 days after that call, he walked into the same branch again. Maybe he thought the first visit had simply been logged. Maybe he believed the staff wouldn't connect the dots. But by then, his name was already attached to the case file. When he referenced my company again and asked about account verification procedures, the staff politely told him the matter had been referred to compliance and that any further questions would require direct authorization from the account holder. He left quickly. The pattern was now clear enough that the bank filed an official incident report with their legal department. That doesn't automatically mean charges. But it does create a permanent record, one that other financial institutions can access if similar behavior appears elsewhere. My attorney called me that evening. "You're fully protected," he said. "Your accounts are locked down, and the bank has documented everything independently. You don't need to confront them. The record already exists." That was exactly what I wanted. I didn't call my parents. They called me. My mother first. Her voice sounded different now. Less confident. She said the bank had been extremely rude to my father and asked whether I had told them something. I told her the bank had simply followed their policies. She went quiet. Later that night my father sent a short message. Why did the bank accuse me of fraud? I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was deciding what to say. Because silence was the clearest answer. A few days later, my brother texted asking whether I could clear things up with the bank. I replied with one sentence. I never asked anyone to access my accounts. After that, the calls stopped. The bank closed the investigation 2 weeks later with a final note stating that unauthorized third-party access had been attempted but prevented before any financial impact occurred. My accounts remained flagged for additional protection. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No courtrooms. No shouting matches. Just a quiet shift. My parents stopped asking about my business. My brother stopped making jokes about it. When we spoke, the conversation stayed on safe subjects: weather, work schedules, small things that didn't require trust. The distance wasn't loud. It was permanent. A month later, I received a new statement from the bank at my office address. Clean envelope. No one else had touched it. I opened it at my desk and filed it away. For the first time in years, my finances, and my decisions, belonged entirely to me. That night, everything was quiet.